My uncle sabotaged my dream job to give it to his son. 10 years later, I'm his boss's boss and he's desperate for a favor. This story really starts when I was a kid, long before I ever entered the professional world. My dad's side of the family was always a bit competitive, particularly between my dad and his younger brother, my uncle Rick. They were two sides of the same coin. My dad was quiet and hardworking, content to let his actions speak for themselves, while Rick was loud, flashy, and always on the lookout for ways to prove he was the best. Family gatherings were often a showcase for Rick's latest accomplishment, whether it was a big sales deal he closed or the expensive new car he bought. For the most part, my dad just let it roll off his back, but the tension between them was palpable to everyone. Even as a kid, I sensed there was something a little off between them, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. It wasn't until much later, when I was old enough to understand the complexities of family dynamics, that I realized what was really going on. Rick wasn't just competitive, he was obsessed with being the better brother, and that extended to everything in their lives, including their kids. I was always a high achiever in school, the kid who studied hard, got good grades, and was involved in every activity I could squeeze into my schedule. I wasn't naturally gifted, but I made up for it with sheer determination. I set my sights on college at an early age, knowing that it was the key to breaking out of my small hometown and building a life for myself. My cousin Brad, on the other hand, was the golden boy who had everything handed to him. Rick and his wife doted on Brad, showering him with everything he could ever want. It was clear from the beginning that Brad wasn't used to working hard for anything. While I was studying late into the night to maintain my grades, Brad was coasting, never really pushing himself. He was smart, sure, but he never applied himself. Why would he? His parents made sure he never had to face any real consequences for his lack of effort. By the time we were teenagers, our paths had diverged even more. I had been accepted to a good college on a scholarship, and I was counting the days until I could start my new life. Brad, meanwhile, was still figuring out what he wanted to do. He had barely graduated high school and didn't have any solid plans for his future. Rick always had an excuse for Brad's aimlessness, saying things like, "He's just finding himself or he's got plenty of time to figure things out." It was frustrating to watch, especially because I knew how hard I was working to secure my future. But at that point, Brad's lack of direction wasn't my problem. I was focused on building my own path, and I didn't have time to worry about what he was doing. Fast forward a few years, and I had graduated college with a degree in a field I was passionate about. I had done everything I could to prepare myself for the real world, internships, part-time jobs, volunteer work, you name it. I was ready to take the next step in my career, and that's when I landed the internship that would set everything in motion. The company I interned for was one of the biggest in its industry, and getting an internship there was no small feat. They only accepted a handful of candidates out of hundreds of applicants, and I was proud to be one of the few who made the cut. I knew that if I played my cards right, this could be the beginning of something huge for me. The internship was tough, long hours, high expectations, and constant pressure to perform, but I thrived in that environment. I loved the challenge and the opportunity to prove myself. By the end of the summer, my hard work had paid off. I was one of the few interns offered a full-time entry-level position with the company. I was thrilled. This was my foot in the door, the chance to work my way up in an industry I was passionate about. My parents were incredibly proud, and they made sure to tell everyone in the family about my accomplishment, including Rick. At the time, I didn't think anything of it. I was just happy to have secured a job in a competitive field. Little did I know, Rick had been paying close attention to everything I was doing, though not for the reasons I thought. Rick and his wife had been worried about Brad for years. He had gone from one dead-end job to another, never sticking with anything long enough to build a career. Brad had no clear direction, and while Rick put on a brave face, I could tell he was frustrated. The more success I achieved, the more it seemed to grate on Rick. He didn't like that his brother's kid was succeeding while his own son was floundering. And so, he decided to do something about it. Rick had always been well connected. He was the type of guy who knew people everywhere, whether it was through business, social circles, or just pure charm. And he used those connections to help Brad at every turn. But this time, he wasn't content with just helping his son, he needed to ensure that I didn't get in the way. About a year into my full-time position, I started hearing rumors about a new job opening within the company. It was a promotion, not a huge one, but enough to give me more responsibility and a higher salary. More importantly, it was a stepping stone to bigger and better things. From what I had heard, I was one of the top candidates for the position. I had built a solid reputation within the company, and my managers seemed to be impressed with my work. I was excited about the opportunity and confident that I had a good shot at landing the job. But then, something strange happened. I didn't get the interview. Weeks went by, and I heard nothing about the position. No callbacks, no updates, nothing. I knew other candidates had already been interviewed, and I started to get nervous. So, I reached out to the hiring team to follow up. Their response was polite but vague. They told me that they were looking for someone with more experience for the role and that I should continue building my skills in my current position. It was a brush-off, plain and simple. I was disappointed, but I figured maybe they were right, maybe I wasn't quite ready yet. That disappointment turned to shock when I found out that Brad had been hired for the job. Brad, who had never shown any interest in my field, who had no experience, and who had barely managed to hold down a job since high school, had somehow landed the position that I had been working my ass off for. I was floored. How had this happened? At first, I didn't know the full story. I assumed that maybe Rick had pulled a few strings, made some calls, and gotten Brad an interview. That was frustrating enough, but I still didn't realize the extent of what had really happened. A few months later, at a family event, I overheard Rick talking to some relatives. He was bragging about how he had helped Brad get the job. As I listened, my stomach turned. Rick had done more than just pull a few strings, he had actively sabotaged my chances. He had gone to the hiring manager, a guy he knew through some business connection, and talked me down. He spun this narrative that I wasn't ready for the role, that I was a hard worker but still too green. He made it sound like hiring me would be a risk, while Brad, in his words, was a perfect fit. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Rick had stabbed me in the back, all so he could give Brad a leg up. I wanted to confront him right then and there, to call him out in front of the whole family. But I didn't. I don't know if it was shock, disbelief, or the realization that nothing I said would change what had already happened, but I stayed quiet. That night, I lay in bed seething. I couldn't stop replaying the conversation in my head, thinking about how unfair it all was. But eventually, that anger turned into something else, determination. I wasn't going to let Rick or Brad define my career. I had worked too hard to get where I was, and if they thought they could knock me down, they were wrong. I threw myself into my work. I took on more responsibilities, stayed late, and volunteered for every project I could get my hands on. I made sure my performance was undeniable, so that when the next opportunity came along, no one could question whether I deserved it. I was determined to succeed on my own terms, without any favors or shortcuts. Meanwhile, Brad floundered in his new role. It became clear pretty quickly that he was in over his head. The job required skills and experience that Brad simply didn't have, and it wasn't long before his lack of qualifications started to show. He missed deadlines, made mistakes, and struggled to keep up with the demands of the position. After about a year, he was quietly demoted. Not long after that, he left the company altogether. I'd like to say that when I heard about Brad's struggles, I felt some sense of vindication, but the truth is, I just felt sorry for him. Rick had set him up to fail. Brad had never learned how to work for something, how to earn his place. Rick had always been there to smooth things over, to make sure Brad didn't face any real consequences for his actions. And now, when Brad finally had to stand on his own, he couldn't do it. He wasn't ready. As for me, my hard work eventually paid off. I continued to climb the ranks at the company, earning promotions and building a reputation as someone who got results. I made a name for myself, not because of who I knew, but because of what I could do. By my late 20s, I was a department head, managing a team of people and making decisions that directly impacted the company's success. I was proud of what I had accomplished, and I knew I had earned every bit of it. But life has a funny way of bringing things full circle. A few years after Brad left the company, I got an email from him. He had hit a rough patch, he had been out of work for a while, and things weren't going well. The email was short and to the point. Brad had heard about a job opening at my company, a lower-level position in one of the departments I oversaw, and he was asking if I could put in a good word for him. I sat there staring at the email, hardly believing what I was reading. After everything that had happened, after Rick had sabotaged my career to help Brad, he was now coming to me for a favor? The audacity was staggering. Part of me wanted to delete the email and never think about it again. I didn't owe Brad anything, and after what Rick had done, I had every right to ignore his request. But another part of me was curious. I wanted to see if Brad would acknowledge what had happened, if he would apologize for the role he had played in it all. So, I replied and suggested we meet for coffee. When Brad walked into the cafe, I barely recognized him. He looked worn down, defeated in a way that I had never seen before. We exchanged awkward pleasantries, but it was clear that neither of us was there for small talk. After a few minutes of uncomfortable silence, I cut to the chase. "Do you remember how you got that job all those years ago?" I asked. Brad shifted in his seat, looking uncomfortable. "Yeah," he said quietly. "My dad helped out." I nodded. "Do you know what your dad did? How he sabotaged my chances to get that job?" Brad looked down at his coffee, clearly uneasy. "I didn't know the whole story," he admitted. "I thought he just put in a good word for me." I shook my head, feeling a surge of anger rise up inside me. "It was more than that," I said, my voice steady but firm. "He went behind my back and made sure I didn't get the job, also you could have it." Brad didn't say anything for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry. I didn't know." I took a deep breath. Part of me wanted to let loose, to tell him exactly how much his dad's betrayal had hurt, but I could see that Brad was already at rock bottom. Kicking him while he was down wouldn't change anything. "I appreciate the apology," I said finally, "but I can't help you. I worked too hard to get where I am, and I'm not going to use my position to bail you out." Brad nodded, looking defeated. We sat in silence for a few more minutes before he thanked me for meeting with him and left. That was the last time I saw him. A few weeks later, I heard through the family grapevine that Brad had found a job somewhere else. I don't know how he's doing now, and honestly, I don't care. I'm not interested in keeping tabs on him or Rick anymore. They're not part of my life, and I'm better off for it. As for me, I've continued to thrive. I'm now a senior executive at the company, overseeing multiple departments and making decisions that affect the entire organization. Every time I think back on that coffee meeting with Brad, I'm reminded of how far I've come and how much I've overcome. I built my career on my own terms, without favors or shortcuts, and that's something no one can ever take away from me. And in the end, that's all that matters. I'm where I'm supposed to be, and Brad? Well, he's still trying to figure it out. After that meeting with Brad, I found myself thinking a lot about the nature of success and how it's earned. Growing up, I'd always believed that hard work was the key to everything. It was something my parents instilled in me from a young age. My dad had worked his way up from nothing, and my mom always pushed me to excel in school, sports, and anything else I took on. They taught me that success was something you had to earn, that it didn't just fall into your lap. But as I grew older, I realized that wasn't always how the world worked. There were plenty of people like Rick and Brad, people who tried to game the system, who believed that shortcuts and connections could get them to the top. And sometimes, it worked. Sometimes, people like Brad landed jobs they weren't qualified for, or people like Rick found ways to manipulate the system. It was frustrating to see, especially when I knew how hard I had worked to get where I was. But here's the thing, those shortcuts almost never last. Brad had been handed a golden opportunity, and he squandered it because he didn't have the skills, the experience, or the work ethic to make the most of it. And as much as I wanted to hold on to my anger toward Rick and Brad for what they did to me, I realized that their actions ultimately didn't matter. They may have knocked me down temporarily, but I got back up. I kept moving forward, kept working hard, and in the end, I came out ahead. In the months following our meeting, I occasionally heard updates about Brad through the family grapevine. He had found a job, but it wasn't anything close to what he had aspired to during that brief stint in my field. From what I understood, he was bouncing between entry-level roles, still searching for something that clicked. Rick, of course, tried to paint a rosier picture of the situation. At family gatherings, I'd hear him talking about how Brad was just exploring his options or finding his true passion. But the truth was obvious to everyone: Brad was lost, and Rick's attempts to shield him from the consequences of his choices had done him more harm than good. It wasn't long before Rick's bravado began to fade. At family functions, I noticed he wasn't as loud or boastful as he used to be. There was no more one-upmanship, no more bragging about Brad's achievements. I think, in some ways, Rick finally realized that he had done his son a disservice. By constantly stepping in to clear Brad's path, he had deprived him of the chance to learn resilience, to develop the skills necessary to navigate the world on his own. Meanwhile, my own career continued to flourish. I was promoted again, this time to a senior leadership position that put me in charge of a large team and several key projects. It was a role that came with significant responsibilities, but I welcomed the challenge. By this point, I had become known within the company as someone who got things done, someone who could be trusted to handle difficult situations and lead with integrity. I was proud of the reputation I had built, not just because of the position I held, but because I had earned it the right way, through hard work, persistence, and a commitment to doing things the right way. There was a sense of satisfaction in knowing that everything I had achieved was because of my own efforts. I didn't have an uncle pulling strings for me or making shady deals behind the scenes. Every promotion, every raise, every accolade, I had earned them. And that sense of ownership over my success was something I wouldn't trade for anything. One day, not long after my promotion, I was at another family gathering. Rick was there, of course, and while we exchanged polite greetings, there was no real conversation between us. I wasn't angry anymore, not really, but I didn't feel the need to engage with him. He had shown me who he was, and I had no interest in being a part of his world. But toward the end of the evening, as people were starting to leave, Rick approached me. "Hey," he said, rubbing the back of his neck awkwardly. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" I was caught off guard. We hadn't had a real conversation since I found out what he had done, and I wasn't sure what to expect. But I nodded, curious to hear what he had to say. Rick looked uncomfortable, which was strange for a man who had always been so confident, even cocky. "Look," he began, "I know things didn't go down the way they should have between you and Brad. With the job and all that. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry." I raised an eyebrow, unsure if I was hearing him correctly. Rick had never been one to admit when he was wrong, and an apology from him was the last thing I expected. "I shouldn't have interfered," he continued, his voice quieter than usual. "I thought I was helping Brad, but, well, I see now that I probably hurt him more than I helped him. And I didn't mean to hurt you, but I know I did. I'm sorry for that." For a moment, I didn't know what to say. Part of me had been waiting for this apology for years, but now that it was here, I wasn't sure how to feel. The anger I had held onto for so long had mostly faded, replaced by a sense of closure. Rick's apology didn't change the past, but it felt like the final piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. "I appreciate that," I said finally, my voice calm but firm. "But you should know, it wasn't just about the job. It was about the fact that you undermined everything I had worked for. I had to rebuild trust and prove myself all over again because of what you did." Rick nodded, his face tight with regret. I know. And I'm sorry for that." There was an awkward pause as we stood there, the weight of years of tension hanging in the air between us. I realized then that I wasn't looking for validation or an extended apology. I had already moved on. I had built something for myself that couldn't be taken away by anyone's manipulation or deceit. And that, in itself, was enough. "I wish Brad the best," I said, my tone softer now. "I really do. But I hope he learns how to stand on his own, without you stepping in." Rick nodded again, looking more humbled than I had ever seen him. "I hope so, too." With that, our conversation ended, and Rick walked away. It wasn't a dramatic reconciliation, but it didn't need to be. For the first time in a long time, I felt at peace with everything that had happened. In the end, life has a way of balancing things out. The success I achieved wasn't about getting back at Rick or proving anyone wrong, it was about doing the right thing for myself, about knowing that my efforts and integrity had brought me to where I was. That sense of fulfillment, of knowing I had done it all on my own, was more satisfying than any apology or acknowledgement from Rick ever could be. And as for Brad? Well, I don't know where his journey will take him. Maybe he'll figure it out one day, or maybe he'll continue to struggle. But that's not my concern anymore. I've carved out my own path, and that's all that matters.